Nice music, well done. No, we were back there talking about what music I want to open up to, and I said the astronauts have an astronaut band, and one of them did a cover of this while he was in space. So I thought that was really appropriate. But thank you. I'm so happy to be here today to be able to talk to you about stories of innovation and collaboration in human spaceflight. So if we could get the charts up, that would be great. There we go. Cool pictures. Anyway, what I wanted to be able to talk to you about today are some of my lessons learned from working at NASA for 30 years. I retired last year, and now I'm working for one of the NASA contractors, support contractors, so I'm starting to see things from the commercial side and all of the bureaucracy that the government used to put in place and how that impedes our ability to be able to innovate and collaborate on the commercial side. But if you look at your industry and the government, when I was working for NASA before, if you look back 20 years, 10 years, things have changed rapidly. And if you think about what could be in store for us the next 10 years, the next 20 years, I can only imagine what your industry will look like, what human spaceflight will look like. But all of that change that has happened, if you think about some of the key themes, it's really people getting together and coming up with new ideas. So collaboration and innovation. And I'd like to spend some time today sharing some of my stories from human spaceflight and some of the things that have enabled us to collaborate better, to innovate, and hopefully you can find some lessons learned from those stories that you can apply to your lives and your industries. So the first story is going to be about the International Space Station. Please tell me that you know we have an International Space Station, please. Okay, yay. Yeah, NASA never did a good job advertising. The International Space Station, we sent up the very first piece back in 1998 on a Russian rocket, and it just parked itself up there. And over the course of the next 13 years, we created what you see in this picture here. End to end, it's about the length of a football field, and the solar arrays are about the length of a football field. Inside, it's about the equivalent living space of about a 6 to 7 bedroom house. But it is a marvel of engineering that we were able to put this together. And I was there from the very beginning. So I was fortunate enough to be assigned to the very first crew that would be flying on board the International Space Station. They launched in October of 2000 and docked to the space station November 2nd of 2000. And ever since then, we have continuously had humans in presence on board the International Space Station. There are people alive today that have not known a world where we didn't have humans on board. And so my first assignment was to make sure that this crew was trained. And we have 3 crew members there. The one in the center is my American crew member, Captain William Shepard, Navy SEAL, and just as mean as could be back then. And he was complaining about everything, how the space station was designed, the instruction he was receiving in the US, and how the Russians were going to operate it. And he was just unhappy. So my boss said, "You get to go out there and make this man happy." Okay. So at 26 years old, 27 years old, I go out to Russia. I meet my crew members. I have my 2 cosmonauts, Sergei Krikalev, who was a hero of Russia. He had flown on the Mir space station. He got left up on the Mir space station when the Soviet Union collapsed. He's like, "Hello, anyone?" So he has been through some stuff, and he was kind of cranky too. And then we had Yuri Gudzenko. So I'm like, oh, okay, this is great. All right, you guys. So I met with them, and I started going to classes with them, both in the US and in Russia. And I'm realizing, oh my gosh, I'd be upset too. Because while Russia and the US had agreed to work together on the International Space Station, they really weren't collaborating. They were still doing our Russian counterparts were doing exactly what they had always been successful doing, and the US was doing what they've been successful doing with the shuttle. But they both needed to change, they both needed to adapt. And when I went out there, NASA told me to try to get the Russians to change to doing our way of business. And I talk about this in the concept of, if you've ever studied the Arbinger theory of inward mindset and outward mindset, I was being programmed to have an inward mindset when my natural tendency is to have an outward mindset. And I went to Russia with an outward mindset instead. And I had a blast. So I met all these engineers, and they were all male engineers, all older than I was, because they'd been doing their jobs for 20 years, some of them for 30 years. And so here I roll in, hi, I'm the expert from the US. And I had to get some credibility there. So I spent a lot of time just learning from them, understanding where they were coming from, not only on the technical side, but getting to know who they were as people and the challenges that they faced just living in Russia, but also the challenges that they face with their management and what they wish they could do. So I was able to find some mutual ground there where we could come together and find joint solutions that would help us. And it was a wonderful time. I lived there for 4 years, and I learned so much that really enabled me to come up with concepts that I could then sell to the management teams on both sides. And we were able to get this cruise successfully launched and on orbit. I'll tell you a little story about the launch. I had spent 4 years of my life with these three guys, and when it came to launch day, they went up, they would crawl up this ladder, they shut the hatch, and as soon as I couldn't see them anymore, I started hyperventilating. And the little Russian general, he's like, "Are you okay?" No, I'm not okay. This is my family. My family's getting locked in a rocket. And he says, "Calm down, have a drink." And then he parted this crowd, and he's like, "At the mama equipage, it's the mother of the crew. It's the mother of the crew." And so he parked me in front of this television that showed me the inside of the vehicle, and he's like, "See, they're okay. They're okay. Это хорошо. Have another drink." But so it was a strange position for me to be in, because I'm an engineer. I understand the risks, but I had bonded with them so closely. So we established lifelong relationships. And when I was 11 years old, Sam was talking about coming from a single parent family. My dad passed away when I was 11, and I was raised in a single parent family. And I always thought, it's going to be awful when I finally get married and there's no one to walk me down the aisle. I had talked to Shep about this during one of our initial trips back in 1998. And he said, "I promise you, if you ever decide to take the plunge, I'll walk you down the aisle." So 20 years later, I called his bluff, and he's like, "Can I wear my New Balance? Do I have to put on a tux?" And I'm like, "Yes, if you show up with a New Balance, I'm gonna pop you." So he shows up, and then Yuri and Sergey, due to COVID, were unable to come, but I have maintained really tight relationships with them. Sergey now is basically the head of the equivalent of NASA in Russia. And so now, anytime something happens, and we've had cases where there was an explosion of a Progress vehicle, which is a logistics vehicle, and the people in the US didn't understand what was happening, I can call him and he will tell me. So part of establishing relationships, having an outward mindset, is to make sure that you collaborate and get the best ideas, but creating that bond, going a step further, you can call in favors, the networking. So events like this, where you get to meet people from different states, supporting with different challenges perhaps, it's a great thing to go above and beyond and really get to know those folks, and because you never know how they might help you in years to come. So that's my space station story. I do have another story that you may be familiar with, and that is from the Columbia tragedy. So back in 2003, I was sitting in mission control on the space station side. This particular shuttle did not visit the space station, but the day before this event, this tragic event, I had arranged for a ship-to-ship comm because we had 2 different crews in space in 2 different orbits, And I just thought it would be cool if they got to have dinner together. So we set up this tie-in, and they had just spoken. So the next day, I'm in Space Station Mission Control. It's very busy. And I knew the shuttle was supposed to land. But I was busy talking to the crew, doing some other things. And then I pulled up the shuttle flight loop, and I start to hear the calls going up to the crew, and the crew's not answering. So I pulled up CNN, and I start to see exactly what you're seeing here on the screen. And that's how I find out about it. That's how Mission Control on the space station side found out about it. As I'm sitting there looking at the TV in complete shock, the crew calls down. Hey, Ginger, how'd the landing go today? They should have, by my watch, they should have been down by now. And so I look at the flight director, and she shook her head. And so I just took a deep breath, and I said, hey, Sox, yeah, sorry about that. It's been a busy day down here. Let me go and check in on them, and I'll get right back to you. And that afforded me enough time for us to privatize the communications, because I knew that if I answered right there, his reaction would be broadcast across the world, and I didn't want that for him. So as soon as we privatized, I called up and I explained to him the situation. And he kept saying, well, but there's going to be the beacons and the parachutes, and surely they're going to find them. And I said, look, they're not going to find them. I can pipe up the television to you so you can see that. And he's like, Ginger, I don't want to see that. Will you just tell me what you're seeing? Yeah, absolutely. So I started conveying to him everything I was seeing on the TV and everything that I was hearing on the loops or on the phone. And that included, well, they found so-and-so's helmet in a field. They found a piece of so-and-so over here. And I just relayed that to him very methodically. And I use this example in a different lecture that I teach about emotional intelligence. But part of doing what's right for your team sometimes is regulating your own emotions. And those emotions that I was feeling deep down had no place in mission control. So I regulated them for the benefit of SOX and to keep calm in the mission control. So eventually, we got through that day, and we got through the days that followed. And our crew, that was their ride home, the shuttle. So now we're trying to figure out, how do we get them home? The shuttle's going to be grounded for a while. The shuttle used to deliver food. Let's do a food inventory, make sure we have enough. So it was a lot going on at NASA. But our focus was, what killed our crew? We've got to go figure out what happened. And when we looked at the original, the films and all of the video, it was telling us that it was probably the foam. And we could not wrap our minds around that. It couldn't have been the foam. It's the equivalent of a styrofoam cup hitting a piece of your Corningware dish and causing irreparable damage. But we said, all right, maybe that is it. Let's test it. And we tested this, and the test was in San Antonio, and it was being broadcast. At the time, I was working in the astronaut office. It was being broadcast back, and we were able to watch it, and our hearts just sunk because we were wrong. And it can happen, and it did happen in this test, and it caused us to question everything. You know, what else could we have been wrong about? And I talk to people about this from the perspective of complacency. Do not get complacent in your industry. In our industry, people die, but in your industry, you are enabling data exchange that could lead to that. So think about that, and don't allow yourself to fall into that spell or into that pit. Just because things have always worked for you doesn't mean that there might not be a better way, a less riskier way, a more efficient way of doing things. So we said, all right, let's look at all the aspects of it. Foam has fallen off. Let's see if maybe we can make the foam out of something different, or we can attach it to the external tank in a different way. And people looked at both of those, and foam was still falling off. So we said, all right, well, we've bought down the risk as much as we can with respect to the foam. Now if it's still going to fall off, let's go see if we can get some good visuals of where it's falling off and whether or not it impacted, and both on the launch pad and in space. So we added all these cameras to the launch pad. But foam, the external tank stayed attached to the shuttle for a good 8 minutes. So it clears the pad fairly quickly. So we're going to need to figure out how to look at the underside of the shuttle once we're up in space. And this is where it is important to create a space for folks to be innovative, to give them the psychological safety to know that if they bring up an idea that sounds crazy, that you're not going to laugh them out of the room or shut them down, because it'll create a shutdown of all ideas. So one of the first ideas that people came up with, so normally the shuttle, the space station is here, the shuttle will approach from underneath, come up here, and dock. And the part that's facing the space station is the other side of the shuttle, the payload bay. That's how it normally approached every time. Well, one of the engineers is like, I know what we could do. We could have the shuttle come over here, pause, and do a backflip. And people looked at him like he was absolutely nuts, but we caught ourselves like, okay, that is 7 degrees of freedom that have to line up spontaneously right here, but okay. How would you propose to do that? I don't know. No, he had an idea of how to do it, and we put the resources together, and sure enough, that's what we decided to do. And it was a crazy idea, but it was a great idea. But the moment we started dedicating resources to that, people felt safe. They felt psychologically safe to come up with more ideas. So not every shuttle, like Columbia, goes to the space station. Sometimes we had other experiments, other priorities that we were executing. So if you're not going to the space station, oh, and let me go back. The reason we would want to do this is so that the astronauts on board the space station could take pictures of the underside. And then they would downlink those pictures and the ground could do it. But if you don't have a space station crew because you're not going to the space station, how do you look at your underside? So somebody comes up with this grand idea, hey, I know. You know the shuttle arm that we have, the robotic arm that helps us get things out of the payload bay? Let's make an extension, and let's make it so that it's 100 feet long. And oh, we're gonna throw some cool little whacked out sensors at the end, and it'll be lasers and infrared, and then we'll just scan the belly like this. And we're like, really? Okay. So, and that's what we did. And they had an automated scan procedure that we could look at the underside of the shuttle, and it helped us see things that weren't necessarily on the surface. So it was great, and we said, okay, yeah, let's do that because that'll be great. And then we said, all right, now let's say we have all these new ways of looking at it, and we find something. Maybe we found a tile that fell off, or something, a hole in the space station. It's not like we can go down the Space Home Depot and grab a caulk gun and go outside and repair it. And then somebody said, or maybe we can. I'm like, what are you talking about? Yeah, but my brain couldn't process that because caulk will act differently in the vacuum of space, but this person figured it out, and that's what we did. We came up with this gun that had goo, and we were prepared to send the crew member outside to re-glue any tiles that fell off. And it was the most innovative time at NASA that I have ever, that has ever been in my 30 years there. And I think it was because of our motivation, and our motivation was, we don't ever want to live through losing another crew. But that can't be the only time that people come together and innovate. So we have to find other motivations that will allow us to collaborate like this and to innovate like this with that type of urgency, because the things we were able to achieve during that time frame unsurpassed for a time frame that I've been there at NASA. So we implemented all these. We were able to start flying the shuttles again after 2 years, and this is the first crew, STS-114, that did it. And the guy on the left, his name's Stevie Ray. He is in the astronaut band that I mentioned. He plays every kind of guitar and banjo known to man, but we actually had to send him outside on that big old 100-foot arm to go remove a piece of what we called gap filler that was protruding from the tiles that could have created an accident. And he wouldn't have been able to do that unless we had enabled him with all of these innovative technology ideas. So it was great, and we were able to start constructing the space station again. So when we had to halt all the shuttles, this is what the space station looked like, the picture on the left. And didn't look anything like the big picture I showed you at the beginning. Well, we had to construct the space station in stages until we were able to install that long truss segment. We first had to put the solar arrays up at the top, and then we would start adding the truss. So in 2003, when we had Columbia, we had temporarily stowed that solar array up at the top. And then right before this next shuttle mission in 2007, we had taken that solar array and we had moved it to the side, and we had 2 solar arrays that were installed. And we needed, when we take the solar array out, what we had done is we had folded it up, because you can't take this big football long thing and have it flapping in space. So we folded it up into a little box about this big. And on this next shuttle mission, we were going to unfold it. And what it would look like, this would be what it would look like. It would start to come out until it was fully extended to the length of a football field. So for this particular shuttle mission, that was one of our missions. We had to unfold this. So we would have, at the end, 2 solar arrays on one side and 1 solar array on another. We were also bringing up what I call a Lego connector for the space station that would allow us to dock a Japanese module and a European Space Agency module at the end. But this solar array needed to be all the way unfurled to produce the power that those 2 modules were going to be required. So we start to unfurl the solar array, and you could see it happening on the big screen in Mission Control. It starts to rip. Those 2 solar cells had stuck together, and we see the rip happening, and they couldn't respond fast enough. There's a slight delay, and you get this big gash. And you may look at this and think, all right, well, that's not that bad. Well, the structural stability of this solar array depended on that not happening. So we could not move. We had to stop midway. We couldn't extend it all the way out because the rip would continue. And we couldn't undock the shuttle because it wouldn't be structurally stable. And of course, we wouldn't be able to power all these great modules that we were going to be adding. So during this mission, I wasn't working in Mission Control. I was part of a team called Team 4. So normally for Mission Control, you have 3 teams supporting. They all work 9-hour shifts, hand over. And then for every shuttle mission, you have a Team 4. And Team 4 just sits around and waits for bad stuff to happen. So we were on day 4 or 5. I'm like, oh, this is going great. I'm going to go to Boston Market and get some food. Anybody want anything? Oh my God, did that just rip? And so we called everybody together, and this person comes up to me and says, it was a little 25-year-old kid, and he says, Flight, I know what to do. I know what to do. And yes, I still have this from 2007. This was my Apollo 13 moment. He comes up and he hands me this, and I'm like, what is this? And he says, cufflink. What? And well, I've done some analysis, and if we can make a lot of these out of stuff that the crew has on orbit, and we'll need short ones, we'll need long ones, we'll need medium-sized ones, but if we put them all in these locations, The solar array will be structurally stable, and then we can unfurl it and get all the power that we need, and we can even undock the shuttle. And I'm like, okay, cufflink. Again, innovative idea that looks insane. I never thought this would be how we roll at NASA, but okay. So I said, I got one other question for you. Do you realize that the tear is so high up that we can't reach it? How are you going to get the crew member out there to install all these cufflinks? Oh, flight, don't worry about that. I've talked to the robotics folks. You know that big arm that we decided we needed to look at the underside of the shuttle? If I grab it at the end and then I pick our tallest crew member and put him at the very tip, he'll just reach. And I'm like, oh my God, I need a new job. No, it's too much. It's too much. And I said, is that structurally stable? Well, I don't know, flight. We're going to go look at that. Okay. So they took this thing and they put the crew member at the end of it, and his name, oddly, before we even launched, his name was too tall. Apparently, we needed to change that to just tall enough. But it was a wonderful feat, and I would not have believed it had I not lived through that. But he installed those things, and it worked. And that was in 2007. And those things are still out there holding this stuff together. So, and we've just extended the life of the space station till 2030. So I'm like, if these things last 23 years, I need to make something else out of them. Because this is some really good craftsmanship. So when the shuttle left, we had both solar arrays extended. So many different ideas that people came up with, that if we didn't have the right mindset, if we didn't cultivate that culture, that we never would have reaped the benefits of. So it is very important that you do create a culture in your industry that allows for this type. And your managers are going to need to set the tone. If I had had the wrong tone, I would have shut down all ideas from then on out. But it was a wonderful success. We were finally able to complete the construction of the International Space Station in 2011. And then, sadly, because we were done, the government decided that we would also end the shuttle program. Now, I would have done things in a slightly different order. You don't ever want to be in a scenario where you do not have the ability to go to space. So our government at the time wanted to change course and say, instead of the government doing low Earth orbit, let's allow the commercial industry to do it, and we can focus on going to the moon and Mars. But commercial industry had not really matured in this area yet, so it would have been better to wait to retire the shuttle until commercial industry got their feet under them. But that's not what happened. So we grounded the shuttles, and commercial crew program began. And we had originally these 7 partners that came with great ideas for how they were going to create the next vehicle that would take our crews back and forth to the space station. And NASA started funding some of these efforts, some of these initial studies, so we could see which ones we would pick. But in the meantime, we needed to maintain continuous human presence on board the International Space Station. So we became more reliant on our Russian counterparts. Prior to this, we would send some crews up on the Russian vehicle, which is called the Soyuz, and we would send some crews up on the shuttle. But now with the shuttle gone, all crews had to go on the Soyuz. When we were doing that, we would do an even exchange. We would fly Russian cosmonauts on the shuttle, and we would fly American astronauts on the Soyuz, but because there was no more shuttle, now we had to pay for it. Originally, the price was $20 million a seat. Every year, that went up. So we kept looking at the commercial industry like, come on, hurry up, we gotta get going. So in 2014, after NASA had looked at all of those initial ideas, they decided on these 2 companies, SpaceX and Boeing. You are the winners. We want you to develop the crewed vehicle. Yes, absolutely. We're going to have it ready in 2016. Only 2016 happened and they weren't ready, and then 2017, and then 2018, and then finally in 2019. 8 years after we had grounded the shuttle, SpaceX has its first successful test flight. And the way we work in human spaceflight is you never want your first flight to have a crew member on it. You always do an uncrewed test flight first, and then you do a crewed test flight, and then only then do you declare it certified for operational use. So SpaceX in 2019 had their first uncrewed test flight. In 2019, in late 2019, Boeing attempted theirs. And you all will appreciate this since you deal with information systems. In Boeing's case, we launched the vehicle. And normally when you launch a vehicle, a timer kicks off to say this is T-0. And then you have software packages that help control the propulsion system, for example, and know that 2 minutes later I should fire these thrusters, and 4 minutes later I should fire these thrusters, so I can put myself on a course that will allow me to intercept the International Space Station. Well, something happened in the software where it did not, the software that was governing control of all these thrusters did not sync up with the launch time. So when these thrusters were supposed to fire, Mission Control is sitting there going, why haven't they fired yet? They just knew the thrusters weren't firing, we were going off course. And we were going off course in a way where we would lose the vehicle. So as soon as Mission Control figured it out, they tried to send a manual command to fire the thrusters, and somehow or another, the vehicle cut off communication. So now they're going off course, and they can't communicate with the vehicle. They eventually figured all that out, got the commands sent, and were able to redirect the vehicle to return to Earth in a safe trajectory. But part of the test flight was to be able to show that you can dock to the International Space Station. So that never happened. And this led to a huge investigation. And I'm showing here 6 months later, they still weren't ready to tell Boeing, to understand what happened and to figure out what needed to change. They did determine at that point that they would need to refly a test flight. So this is in late 2019. And we all remember what happens next in 2020. So these two companies are marching along, and then COVID hit. And SpaceX had done their successful uncrewed test flight. They were ready. They were ready to do their crewed test flight. And then COVID happened. They were going to launch in April, but the world stopped. And so I called my counterpart. At the time, I was in an area where I was in charge of crew training. And my SpaceX counterparts were doing the training for this particular vehicle. But we got together, and I said, all right, we got to figure out how to get these crew members out to your facility, and I still have to train them on emergency procedures and all of this stuff. So we figured out a good way of keeping them safe, housing them in different places, flying them over there in a dedicated aircraft, making sure that everybody got tested, before. So it was this big to-do, but we were able to get them launched in May. So COVID hits in March, and we were able to get them launched in May. So it was a remarkable feat. SpaceX was outstanding in this capacity. They figured, they were on top of it and figured it out, and they were not going to be deterred. So we got that crew successfully docked to the space station. They stayed there for a couple of months, and more importantly, we tested that the parachutes and the landing approach, because they land in the ocean, there's a boat that has to go pick them up, you have to get them on the well deck, and then you have to get them safely back. All of that worked fine, and we had to do all that with people being masked, and it was insane. But we were so happy to be able to demonstrate this, because this meant that we could declare them operational, and we would now have a way of launching U.S. crew members from U.S. soil and landing U.S. crew members on U.S. ocean. So meanwhile, 2022. So Boeing's initial attempt was December of 2019. In 2022, they launched their second attempt, and it docks with the space station for the first time, but had some software issues. So as of August, they have been delayed again for the crewed test flight until 2023. So bottom line, I'm not saying this to say bad things about Boeing or good things about SpaceX. I'm showing you this to show how hard human spaceflight is. And when, as a government agency, if you are looking to hand things over to commercial industry, it takes some time. Some of the things that we do are more challenging, and that's why we do them as a government entity. So we need to have patience with them, and we want them to continue to grow because we want to be able to focus on what's next. So NASA, I asked about the space station. How many of you heard of Artemis? Please tell me you've heard of Artemis. Okay, good. This is good. So I went down there for the launch in September and then came back because we didn't launch because we had a hydrogen leak. And then I went back for the second non-launch because we had a hydrogen leak. And I'm going to go back for the third time. And if we have a hydrogen leak, I'm going to lose it. But it's probably going to be around Thanksgiving, somewhere between the 17th and the 27th. NASA will try again. And this, like true to form, uncrewed test flight. We're going to have an uncrewed test flight, and I say uncrewed because Snoopy's flying, yay! We have astronaut Snoopy flying in here and a couple of mannequins that are well instrumented so that we can understand the radiation effects, because we're going to be on the back side of the moon in an orbit that we've never been in before, and we want to make sure we understand the radiation effects. So this is a profile trajectory of the Artemis mission. Not going to go through all this in detail, but bottom line is we're going to slingshot around the moon. We're going to go around, cruise about 60 miles above the surface, and wish we could dock, or Snoopy will wish he could dock, land on the moon, and then we'll stay in orbit for a couple of weeks, and we'll test out these systems to make sure that they'll be safe for our second crewed flight, which will have a crew on it. And we're going to use these crew members. They are not going to land on the moon. They are going to test the life support system equipment. They're going to test some of the manual flying capabilities that will be required when we do land on the moon. And then one of these individuals will set foot on the moon. Actually, two of these individuals will set foot on the moon. So NASA has announced that this is the pool of eligible candidates that will set foot on the moon on our third mission. And right now, it is scheduled to occur in late 2025. And how will we land on the moon? It won't be the Orion spacecraft that the crew uses to launch. It'll be a commercial spacecraft. So there was a competition to see which company would get awarded the ability to land on the moon, and SpaceX won. And you have to squint, but look at the tiny little people at the foot of this thing. It is huge. And the reason it's so big is SpaceX intends to use this vehicle to take people to Mars. So they're using this as a test bed, just like NASA is. That's the reason we're not going directly to Mars. There are certain things we need to learn on the surface of the moon before we do that. But this is going to be exciting to watch. Eventually, we'll have a small orbiting space station around the moon called Gateway that will allow our crew members the ability to, to have easier access to the surface of the moon, but a safer and larger place to call home up at the top. We're going to have lunar terrain vehicles that are unpressurized, little buggies, and then we're going to have pressurized rovers, and there's all these companies that are out there right now building these. It's not NASA that will be doing this. But eventually, the goal is to have a sustained presence on the moon, unlike we did for Apollo, and have a base camp and really understand what it's like to live on a different surface, on a different planet, so that we can take those lessons learned to Mars and beyond. And this, going back to the moon effort, is a true collaboration. I have never seen a program in my 30 years at NASA where all the NASA centers are participating. And not only all the NASA centers, but we have commercial companies everywhere. And eventually we're going to be inviting internationals to be participating with us. Some of them already are. The European Space Agency is already doing that, but we're going to be looking at Japan and some other companies, and Canada and some other companies as well. So there's a lot going on. Folks are still a little concerned about integrating all of those different people with all of those different interests, particularly government and commercial. We're already seeing, NASA is ultimately responsible for the mission. How do you get enough insight into what risks are being accepted at these different companies so that you have a really good understanding of the overall risk in the Artemis program? So people like yourselves in the world of information technology, information security, how do we provide folks the data that they can use to make these types of decisions? And so it's a documented concern, and NASA is actively trying to mitigate that. But that concludes my story time with all of my lessons learned from my 30 years of human spaceflight. I wanted to be able to highlight, I hope you can pull out some of the lessons regarding collaboration and innovation, and I hope there's something in there that you can take away to help you do business better.